This, in my opinion, is possibly the best street and travel photography camera you can currently buy. Hell, it's even the best street and travel photography camera I've ever tested, and that is not a statement that I make lightly. In fact, it's not even a sentence I was even expecting to say at the start of this review, because I've had somewhat of a rocky history with this lineage of camera, but we'll talk more about that in this video. But for now, this is of course the Fujifilm X100VI, or X100VI, whatever you want to call it, because Fujifilm have finally decided to do the logical thing and consistently use Roman numerals to name them instead of using a cryptic string of letters. And if you have no idea what I'm barking on about, basically this is the sixth camera in the X100 range, and before that we had the X100V or X100V. Before that there was the X100F, then the X100T, then the X100S, and finally the original X100, which was released all the way back in March 2011. And you're probably looking at this and thinking, what the hell is going on with this naming system, because these letters appear to be completely random. But they actually do have some relevance to the order in which these cameras were released. The S stands for second, the T stands for third, and you guessed it, the F stands for fart in my mouth. I mean fourth, it stands for fourth. Sorry, I always get those two mixed up for some reason. Of course, once you know that, and you understand where Fujifilm was going with that naming system, but it isn't all that obvious, so I'm glad that Fujifilm has decided to stick to the Roman numerals. But anyway, I've always been a big fan of these cameras ever since the release of the original X100, mainly because I just love the idea of owning a beautifully styled compact camera with a decent sized chip and high quality prime lens to boot. So in 2017 I finally saved up enough money to buy an X100T, and I actually got super lucky and managed to find an X display model online somewhere that had literally taken like 200 shots but was priced with a whopping 50% discount. Needless to say, I was absolutely buzzing to start using it, but to keep a long story short, fast forward a year later and I ended up just selling it, having only used it a handful of times. Now don't get me wrong, I absolutely loved the build quality, the analog style controls, and the image quality was also great, but the one thing that made me get rid of it was the autofocus. It absolutely sucked, and I just felt that whenever I took it with me I was missing way too many shots. So after selling the X100T I was pretty disenfranchised with the whole X100 series, and I just put the whole experience to the back of my mind and moved on with my life until February 2020 rolls around and Fujifilm releases the X100V. Now you probably remember that this was the camera that unexpectedly broke the internet, because pretty much every social media influencer under the sun was buying this camera and just raving about it online. But it wasn't just the hipsters and travel vloggers raving about the X100V. A lot of credible photographers were also going on the record to say what a good camera the X100V was. And I'll admit, ever since then, part of me has been very tempted to give the X100 series another try. But the fact that the X100V was practically sold out the minute it was released, and it was also pretty expensive, I never got the chance to actually try it. So when Fujifilm kindly offered to loan me this brand new X100VI for a few weeks, I practically bit their hand off at the opportunity. So what changes have been made to this new X100VI, and is it really worth the lofty $1,600 price tag? Well, let me start by saying that about 90% of this camera has been left unchanged from the previous model. It looks the same, the button layouts are basically the same, it has the same viewfinder, the same lens, and the same rear touchscreen, albeit that it can now tilt down slightly further by an extra 15 degrees. But I guess that does make sense. It's kind of a case of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because overall the handling of this camera is still superb, and I love the ergonomics just as much as I did back when I had the X100T. Granted, this new version has received a handful of design tweaks since then. The main dial on the top controls the shutter speed, but lifting it up will grant access to the ISO control too, which I absolutely love. There's a manual aperture ring around the lens, and there's also a separate dial for exposure compensation, which for me personally is a must-have. But if you're new to photography and all of these analog dials seem a little bit daunting to you, or you just prefer using a standard front and rear command dial arrangement, then you can just alter the exposure settings using these two command dials instead. As I've already mentioned, this uses the same viewfinder as the previous model, and it's the same sort of hybrid design as you can find on the X Pro line of mirrorless cameras. And I actually own the X Pro 2, and I can honestly say I've used this as much as I use it on the X Pro 2, and that's never. Personally love the look and the idea of using an optical viewfinder, but for me personally, I just find it a little bit too impractical. So 9 times out of 10, I'm either switching this over to the fixed EVF view, or I'm using the rear flip out screen. Now this camera uses the same battery type as the previous model, which is also compatible with other Fujifilm mirrorless cameras. And next to the battery compartment is a single SD card slot. Slightly annoyingly though, attaching a tripod plate to the bottom of this camera will completely block this door from opening. So if you do use a tripod regularly, this is guaranteed to bring your piss to a boil. But unless you're using super slow shutter speeds, you may never need to use a tripod with this camera because Fujifilm have added in-body image stabilization, offering up to 6 stops of stabilization or 5.5 stops when using the optical viewfinder for some weird reason. Now, if you combine this with the built-in 4-stop ND filter, it's now even easier than ever to experiment with slow shutter speeds on the fly. Now, I'll admit this is not a feature that you're going to use all of the time, but having a camera that provides a greater wealth of creative options at the press of just a few buttons is definitely something that I appreciate. Plus, this ND and IBIS combo isn't just useful for photographers, it's obviously great for video work too, and this is an area where this camera has received a significant upgrade. But before we can talk about video, we've first got to talk about the new sensor in this camera, as one of the major updates to this X100VI is it now features Fujifilm's 40 megapixel X-Trans5 sensor, giving it around 14 megapixels more than its predecessor. This higher resolution sensor now allows it to capture 6.2K video in 422 10-bit in a choice of H.264 or H.265 formats. Or if that sounds a little bit overkill, you can shoot in 4K HQ mode, which uses 6.2K oversampling. And both of these options that I've just mentioned are available up to 30 frames per second. The downside though is that both of these modes suffer from horrendous amounts of rolling shutter, so if this kind of thing really bothers you, then you're probably better off sticking to the standard 4K option, as this will improve the readout speeds and therefore reduce that jello effect. Now, I imagine most people aren't going to be buying this camera to shoot vast quantities of 6K video footage, but just having the option to capture super high quality video when you're maybe out and about and don't have your main video camera with you is certainly an incredibly helpful option to have in a pinch. But as I found out firsthand with the X100T, all of this fancy design and impressive list of specs really doesn't mean a lot if the camera isn't able to capture sharp images. So how does it handle in terms of autofocus? Well, unsurprisingly, the X100 series has come on quite a long way since 2017, and just like modern Fujifilm cameras, the AF on this camera is quick and accurate, meaning that the hit rate compared to my old X100T is like night and day. With the flip out screen being touch sensitive, you can obviously use this to move around the active AF point, but personally I found that it was just way too easy to accidentally move this point out of position if your palm comes into contact with it whilst you're carrying it around. And this is partly down to the fact that I've just got ginormous hands, but also because the screen sits so flush to the back of the camera, meaning there's virtually no lip acting as a physical buffer. Now don't get me wrong, I think the design of this screen is absolutely beautiful. I love the fact that it is completely flush to the camera and it makes it feel way more classic. So I really wouldn't want it any other way. And besides, there is actually a proper joystick on the back here for moving the AF point around anyway, so I just immediately deactivated the touchscreen and I've been using this joystick ever since. But this camera also benefits from the latest line of AF tracking modes too, allowing it to identify and lock onto people, animals, planes and trains. In continuous burst mode, this camera can shoot up to 11 frames per second using the mechanical shutter, or up to 20 frames per second if you shift over to the electronic shutter. But most importantly, what about the image quality? Well, as you would expect from a Fujifilm camera, the images this thing produces are packed with details and have beautiful colors straight out of the camera. Although I've seen a few people online suggesting that the increased 40 megapixel resolution is kind of an unnecessary addition, personally I really appreciate having that extra resolution to play around with in post for making tighter crops when required. Also, with this being a Fujifilm camera, it's going to come included with the latest list of Fujifilm film simulation modes, including the most recent addition, Reala Ace. Now, I'm actually a really big fan of using these film sims for taking photos of my family at the weekends, because it just means you can capture great looking images without creating a bunch of additional editing work for you to do later on. But if you do prefer to edit your own RAWs, then you'll be pleased to know that the files generated by this camera offer an impressive amount of flexibility in post, and even shots like this, which I thought was just completely blown out beyond recovery, were able to be fixed in Lightroom with ease using just a single slider. Also, as a slight side note, all of the images you're seeing here have been edited using my Lightroom preset pack, which is available for purchase on my website if you're interested. Oh, and make sure you use the discount code on screen now to receive an additional 10% off.
Oh, do you want some? I'll give it up.
Now, we really couldn't talk about image quality without also mentioning the lens, and luckily for me, this camera comes fitted with a 23mm f2, which, once you factor in the 1.5 times crop, produces images that look similar to a 35mm lens on a full frame camera. And if you've watched any of my videos before, you'll know that I really love shooting with a 35mm lens. But if you personally need something wider or just need a little more reach, then you can actually screw on various conversion lenses to the front of this lens for added flexibility. So considering at the start of this video I said that this is probably the best travel and street photography camera you can buy, you might be wondering, have I already pre-ordered my own X100VI? specs? Well, somewhat ironically, the answer would be no, and I'll probably never buy this camera just for one reason. As incredible as I think this camera is, I would only ever end up using it for unpaid personal work, and as someone who is pretty frugal with their own money, I can't seriously justify spending $1,600 on something that I'll only ever use as a weekend carry-along, as much as I really do want one. But if you're not quite the broke-ass bitch that I clearly am, and you're seriously considering buying this X100VI, then I really can't think of many things that would dissuade you from picking up this near-perfect pocket camera.